birthday events to celebrate our 6th birthday. We've done a lot of cheesy beer events over the years. I think this is our 5th time we've done a cheesy beer event with our great friend, great supporter of BentSpoke, Mike the Cheesesmith. Mike, how you going?
Good, Rich.
Let's have a cheers, eh?
Let's do it. What a better way to kick off a cheesy beers event. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers to you, and cheers to everyone at home who's tuning in. Welcome.
So we might do a little bit of housekeeping here just to keep everyone informed about how it's all going to flow tonight. We're going to just get in a little bit of an intro in a minute. Then we'll dive into our first pairing. We'll probably have a few questions in between each pairing. So question out there. Make sure you fire it in. You'll win a merch pack. Best question out there. We'll probably try and get through 3 to 4 cheeses. And then we're going to have a 10-minute break. Probably because Instagram will run out, and at the same time we'll run a little quiz. So fastest person to answer the 5-question quiz will win a merch back through Facebook and YouTube. So that's sort of how it's all going to go down. I'm Richard, co-founder of BentSpoke Brewing Co. We've got our 6th birthday on. Obviously started BentSpoke in 2014. We love celebrating our birthday. It's always a big milestone. It just showcases what the change has been from year 5 through to year 6. And I guess some of the highlights would simply be that we're in our production brewery now out at the cannery with stainless. We've got lots of tanks in here producing a heap of different beers. We've been able to get our first barrel-aged beers in cans out this year, and you've got a couple of those to look forward to a bit later on. Also, I guess pre-COVID, having 96 people on our team was that's a pretty big thing, and really massive achievement, I think, for our company. Obviously, experiencing COVID, it's been crazy times, as I know everyone out there's been through together. We've managed to keep ourselves going, keep ourselves afloat. We're all coming out the other end now, so it's a good time to start to look at celebrating a few things. So, but that's enough from me. You probably got to know me before. So how about I introduce Mike? Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Mike Smith from the Cheesesmith, founder of the Cheesesmith. And we founded in 2013. So it was actually during our first year that I did my first event with Richard, which was super exciting for me. And it's been incredible to see BentSpoke's journey since then. I've gone into cheese a bit of a weird way. I never worked in the hospitality industry, but I had the great fortune of growing up with French grandparents as a kid. And that's an experience I wish I could just do all over again, because the flavors, the things I was taught from my grandma, who was a sensational chef, were just some of the things that I've held on to and will take with me in everything I do, culinary particularly, and really shaped, I guess, who I am today and what the Cheesesmith is today. So I grew up with cheese, which, I guess at the time in Sydney was really hard to do. It was hard to achieve because you couldn't really get great imported cheese at the time. But nonetheless, my grandma and the food that we ate, the Dauphinois potatoes, everything that we had, just had the best French cheese that she could acquire, sometimes through, I think, secret dealings. When my grandparents died, I lost that, unfortunately, and I was too young to quite understand how important that was. And so career-wise, I actually moved into more entertainment. So I've worked in film, worked in theatre, in events, and I still predominantly do quite a lot of that when I'm not cheesing the world. But doing that, actually touring international theatre projects, took me back to France. It took me across Europe, and I started to rediscover those flavors that I grew up with, thanks to my French grandma. And for me, it was that nostalgia feeling you get when you hear a song from your childhood or you taste something from your childhood. I was getting that all over Europe, flavors that I just never had since their passing. And so I got excited and I started bringing some of it back into the country. Probably not necessarily legally in the beginning, but I missed those flavors at home so much. So I worked out how to bring it into the country, and I started bringing in cheese just for myself in the beginning. And then, of course, I go to parties and take it to friends' houses, and they go, "Oh, it's great, get me some." So my orders got bigger, and a collaboration of that and my event work saw me start to do catering for some bigger parties, bigger events, weddings, and that's essentially how the Cheesesmith was born. So since forming the Cheesesmith, we do a lot of weddings, a lot of parties, a lot of corporates, and we actually try to do unique cheese pairings with different alcohols. We have never actually done cheese and wine formally. We love doing cheese and beer, cheese and gin, cheese and Korean soju, cheese and whiskey. And also cheese and chocolate and other things that are a little bit unconventional. And that's what we love doing. We don't quite have 96 staff in our books. At biggest I've had 7 doing events for City Festival and such. But I'd say 2 staff are probably the ones that I've kept on and off the most, and conveniently and rather unbelievably, their surname is Cheeseman. So it's kind of awesome to have them involved in the business. People don't believe it; they have to show their license all the time. But me and the Cheeseman, we've done a lot of cheese work, and this event is really exciting because it's actually the first time that I've distributed nationally through BentSpoke. So for all those people that are interstate, welcome, and
Cheers.
Welcome to BentSpoke, welcome to Cheesesmith, and I'm so excited for you to try some of these flavors because there's some pretty exciting and really rare cheeses here today.
Yeah, well, I got into cheese a little bit similar in a way because I remember going on a family holiday over to Europe, and I was only 14, and we went to Netherlands and of cheese and managed to bring them back in some boxes that we sent back, and had that little moment when we got home and ripped those cheeses out and cut the wax off and had some cheese. And Tracy will tell you that I keep a shitload of cheese in our fridge, and when I make a cheese sandwich, it looks like 3 slices of bread. So I think we've got all these magnificent cheeses in front of us, and starting to get a little hungry. So we might look at getting into the first cheese.
Let's do it.
And how about you go first with the cheese?
Yeah, sure.
And I'll back it up with the beer.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Sounds good. Well, yeah, I'm hungry. I'm sure you guys at home are hungry too. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. First of all, the crackers that all you guys got in your boxes are actually gluten-free, in case anyone's that way inclined. But they're my favorite crackers to pair with cheese. I don't tell any loss of flavor or anything from the fact that these are gluten-free. They're actually made by Byron Bay Cookie Company, and they are phenomenal crackers. So everyone can enjoy those without having to worry. If you happen to have some at home, soft cheese, I actually personally prefer to pair with sourdough, and all kinds of sourdough, from white to rye, even seeded sourdough. Any good quality bread is perfect, in my opinion, with soft cheese. So personally, I'd hold the crackers for later, but if you don't have any sourdough at home, crackers will also go awesome with this. It really doesn't matter. So let's talk about this cheese. It's for those who aren't sure, I'm sure you got the menu in front of you and you should have all had labels, but it's the one soft cheese that came in your pack, and it's called a Dauphinois. Now, for those who haven't heard of a Dauphinois, it's actually essentially a double cream cheese. And so all of you would know Brie and know Camembert, standards that you can pick up in a supermarket. They're all a single cream cheese, which means they've got roughly 25 to 30% fat content inside them. That's why, when they start to age, they start to get heavy, they start to ooze out. That's the perfect age to eat them. But a Dauphinois is essentially double the cream. So that means instead of 25 to 30% fat content, it's about 50 to 60% fat content, which in my opinion is getting just about the right amount of fat. So there for your decadence. You'll notice that with this one particularly, it's got a real buttery taste and buttery consistency. You can also move cheeses, and those guys are just like a lot of butter in consistency. They're so thick. But Dauphinoise for me, well, for a lot of Cheesesmith clients are a favorite. It's the most popular cheese that we distribute. And the reason is because of buttery consistency. You can't quite get what you get in this cheese in a supermarket cheese that are mass produced. These are generally made in France. Some of them are handmade. This one in particular is aged in a wooden box, which is more of an old technique of how to age cheese. But the reason it's done in a wooden box is wood actually extracts the moisture out of the cheese. So when you first make the cheese, there's a lot of moisture in it, and it slowly dries out as it ages. When you do it in a pine box, it actually helps to extract that moisture out quicker. And then when the cheese starts to dry out, magically, it actually starts to extract some of the moisture back into the cheese so it doesn't dry out too much. So it creates this nice little environment, like a little habitat for the cheese to naturally curate. And so it's made with a bit of a traditional technique, but it's, for me and for many of our customers, it's a bit of a personal favorite. So I'll let Rich tell you about the beer that I think goes perfectly with this cheese. Go for it.
Yeah, look, most of you probably know this beer, Little Crankshaft over here. That was one of our first beers that we obviously inspiration came from a number of IPAs that were coming out on the market at that time, especially out of the US. And I think the idea with this IPA is to keep drinkability at the front, but still ticking the boxes for an IPA. So we've used 4 different hops in this beer. We've used Equinox, Simcoe. We've used Equinox, Simcoe, Mental Blanc, Citra, and a little bit of Mosaic in there as well. So it gives a real sort of fruity character, nice bit of citrus character. And I think when we talk about beer and food, the things I like to talk about are the 3 C's, and that is you want to have something that you want to have flavours that you can compare, you want to have flavours that contrast, and then you want flavours that cleanse. And I think we're going to be having a lot of fatty cheeses tonight, and I think the reason why beer goes really well with cheese is because of the cleansing factor. And this is the part that I think works really importantly well with this particular cheese. I think the citrus characters also work pretty well, but the cleansing factor in this beer actually cleansing that cheese, I think, is for me why this pairing works really well.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll actually get some quite grass notes out of this cheese in particular around the rinds, and I think that those grass notes and that citrus actually blend beautifully together when you combine these. Personally, like in terms of the pairing and the eating and drinking of these, and for a lot of these, I think it's almost better to still have a little bit of cheese in your mouth when you take and you really get an idea of how they cleanse. In some cases, you get contrasting things. In some cases, you get more conventional cleansing pairings. But overall, you end up with a nice balance, or you get cheeses and beers that bring out different qualities in each other. These two, I think, are a great cleanser.
Let's have some.
Let's do it. Everyone at home, join in if you haven't already. I'm sure you have. Actually, the version of this cheese that we have here tonight is one that I couldn't cut up to send out to you guys because it was just too soft. If I tried to wrap this up, it would have been an absolute mess when you guys unwrapped it. So this is a perfect age, really, to eat a soft cheese when you open it up and after about 10 minutes, it starts oozing out in the plate. I think some of yours will be starting to get to that point now, but ours is definitely oozing.
And I think when you have the cheese and the beer on your palate together, those flavours do really combine. It's amazing how that real creamy texture and that richness from the cheese really does, appreciate a little bit of beer sneaking up on it, and a bit of citrus and a bit of that bitterness as well to provide that cleansing character.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna have another go here.
I'm gonna have a lot more goes, I think. And tonight, I'm sure it's yours too. When I first take a sip of this beer after having this cheese, I actually get a bit of a strong stronger punch right at the beginning, and then that just disappears, and it really balances nicely. It's a beautiful combination, and I mean, there's a reason why this has won Best IPA in Australia for a few years, right? But it's a perfect cheese pairing. I might actually throw. We've got a couple of questions up on the screen. Yeah,
let's go.
And the first one's actually from Graham Schumann, who asked, "Why do you import cheese?" And as I kind of said, I guess in the introduction, originally it was just for me, and I started importing French cheeses and actually particularly Dutch cheeses, because even now I think we don't get very good Dutch cheese here in Australia. Fortunately, we've got some really good examples here tonight that I'm going to talk you through. We'll get to those later. But I started bringing in cheeses that I thought were difficult to get here, and flavors that I couldn't get here. And it was really just for my own indulgence. And then as I started taking those cheese to friends' houses, orders just got bigger. So that's why I started importing cheese. And now I actually work with a few other importers now, so that some of the cheeses that I get regularly are a little bit easy to bring in. But whenever I do go to Europe for work, which is generally around once a year, I try and find more cheeses that have never been to Australia before. And one of the cheeses we've got here is actually quite a difficult one to get in Australia, which is very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew Fisher says, why are there no Australian cheeses on the list?
That's a good question. I do actually use a lot of Australian cheeses and do a lot of events with Australian cheeses. But a couple of reasons. Australian cheeses, the biggest problem with Australian cheese is unfortunately the cost, down to Australian labour costs. The cost to run a farm, it's very expensive. And so when we're doing an event like this, where I'm buying a lot of bulk and cutting up a lot of bulk, it's actually more cost effective to use European cheeses. But also, for majority of the varieties of cheese, European cheeses are much more developed. And so when it comes to pairing, there are some Australian cheeses that are magnificent for pairing, but I actually prefer Australian cheeses for pairing with liquors, with whiskies, with gins, because you get a lot more botanical notes out of them. But for beer, I actually think European cheeses have body in them that Australian cheeses. So, well, I mean, there's amazing Australian cheeses, don't get me wrong, but I think for the ones that I can get in bulk in particular, don't quite have the same qualities that I look for when I'm pairing with a beer.
And I guess cheeses that come from overseas, cheeses that are made in Australia, don't have those old caves or those old barns or those old aging cellars that provide a lot of that bacteria and a lot of that, in-house sort of flavour.
Yeah.
I think obviously Australia's still developing a bit of age to a lot of its, buildings to aged cheeses like that. I've noticed it's similar to charcuterie in a way as well. I mean, you can make really good charcuterie, but a cave or a shed or a cellar that's been around for 300 years really does contribute unique characters, bacteria and flavours to both cheese and charcuterie.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And I think what Australia does really well in terms of cheeses is make up its own cheeses. And so as opposed to trying to have a Swiss Gruyere or something, I think we're talking 1,000-year-old recipes, and it's going to be hard to replicate that, particularly with Australian climate. And like Rich said, aging is easier in Europe for a lot of styles of cheese because of the climate, the altitude in particular, and so trying to recreate European cheese is actually difficult in Australia, whereas Australian goat's, and that's because I think we don't try and recreate other types of famous European cheeses. We're actually creating our own style, new style of cheese, and they're beautiful. They're really unique. Getting cheese on myself. I forgot to say that.
That's all good.
Okay. Keep going. No worries.
So the next pairing, we sort of step it up in terms of the beer. And I think we probably step it up a little bit in terms of the cheese.
Absolutely.
So the next pairing is Sprocket for the beer, and Sprocket was an IPA that we developed not long after Crankshaft, not long after we opened the pub. I think Sprocket came on in September, so sort of 3 to 4 months after we opened, and we wanted something a bit bigger. We wanted to be able to use more hops. So when you're making beer or IPAs that are stronger and have more malt, and I think a good IPA, one of the key features of a good IPA is to have a really good malty fun, and then you can just layer those hops in over the top and keep using hops until you basically can't use any more. And that's pretty well our Sprocket. We're using well over 140 kilos of hops in a 10,000 litre batch, and because the beer's 7%, because the beer's then got more malty backbone, we can really layer in those hops. So this is more tropical. So this has got a lot of tropical characters. Thinking passion fruit, maybe a little bit of pineapple, and this type of IPA, as opposed to the more citrus heavy one like Crankshaft, definitely goes down a little bit differently to the Crankshaft. I think the alcohol also plays a part. Matching food to Crankshaft versus Sprocket, the alcohol definitely plays a bit of a part in terms of that cleanse factor as well. And how about the cheese?
Well, this is an interesting one, actually. So I'm actually just going to bounce off a question that's come up because it kind of relates to how this pairing happened. And Toby Sharp asked, how do you decide to pair specific beers and cheeses? Do you choose the beers first or do you choose the cheeses first? So how this relationship with BentSpoke and Cheesesmith began, when we first looked at doing a pairing together, it was actually one first beer and cheese pairing sessions in terms of the Cheesesmith. And so, all right, how are we going to do this? I read up a lot on nodes, and I thought the only way to do it is to try every combination possible and see how things work. So I drove from Sydney down to Canberra with a box full of cheese, and Rich sorted us out with a nice selection of beers from the tap at the brew pub in Braddon, and we sat there with beers and cheeses for days and just tried things, took notes, put things together, worked out what the best combinations were, both in flavour but also in terms of the overall experience and how we can sort of map out a journey from start to finish. And that for me was probably one of the best days of my career because it was
one of the best days of mine.
Just sitting there with 20 cheeses and a line of beers and just saying, all right, let's work this out. And it was such a mind-blowing experience. But I've done a few of those sessions now. Actually, Sprocket, which we used to pair with a soft cheese. And after doing an event with BentSpoke earlier this year, Beer Fest in Canberra, I was very fortunate to be sent home with some BentSpoke beers. And I got a bit excited, opened up my cheese fridge, opened all the beers, and just did another session by myself in my kitchen. And I came up with a combination that I think is actually and it's not one that I would have jumped to before. There's a lot of tasting notes in Sprocket. It's really a bright beer, and the cheeses that we've got for this beer are actually quite have a lot of depth and a lot of flavour. But together they create something quite magical. So I'll just explain. There's two cheeses involved here, and that's because one of the cheeses there wasn't enough in the country. So the rest of you have another cheese which in terms of flavor characteristics is actually quite similar. Now I'm going to talk about the Gouda first, which some of you will have. So it's a signature Gouda, or as the Dutch say, Gouda. Thank you. And this is a bit of a traditional. I said before that there's a couple of Dutch cheeses on the table here, which I think will introduce you to what I think real Dutch cheeses are all about. And this is definitely one of them. For those of you who don't have the Gouda and you have the Mimolette, you're not missing out on much because the Mimolette is a fantastic cheese, and I'll tell you all about that one in a second. But the Gouda is, this one in particular is an interesting Gouda or Gouda because it uses a very different aging technique, and they actually age it in a really quite warm cheese room in terms of cheese aging and processing. A lot of cheeses are aged in around the sort of 10 degree, varying, but this is aged from a minimum of 14 degrees for a lot of its maturity process. And by doing that, it does a couple of things. Because this is a cheese that is made in North Holland, where there's a lot of sea flats. I can't remember what the term is, but basically there's a lot of flat. Obviously, Holland's very flat, but it's very close to the water, and there's a lot of salt content in the grass. And so what that means is when the cows eat the grass, and this is also bouncing off Jim Owen's question about what impact is on cheese, the more salt content in the cheese, it actually makes a big difference on how the stomachs process milk. And so this in particular is one of the grassiest areas of the Netherlands. One of the saltiest grass areas in the Netherlands. And so when you age this cheese in this warmer temperature, what it does is it actually starts to process proteins a lot very, very differently. And you'll notice that in some hard cheeses, even in Parmesan, you get these little crunchy bits, which are in some cheeses are called calcium lactate. In this, they're actually called tyrosine, or in the cheese world is called, and there are actually a concentration of those proteins, essentially, where it's actually extracting the salt out of the milk and pulling them into these crunchy little pockets. And you'll notice in this cheese in particular, I don't know if I have an example here, but you guys might at home, where it's actually got big holes like that sort of traditional Swiss cheese that you used to get in the supermarket. And those holes are filled with what looks like a white mold. It looks like it might be bad. It's not. It's the best part of a cheese you're ever. It's this concentration of salt and flavor. It's like all the flavor that's in the cheese is compacted into these beautiful little crunchy crystals. And it makes for a remarkable cheese experience. But it's a very punchy cheese. It has a lot of caramel sort of notes. And personally for me, I even get a little bit of a Vegemite note from this cheese. It's really punchy. Yeah, but paired with the sprocket, it's not too punchy. And the really bright things that I get from drinking a sprocket are also balanced in with the caramel notes and the Vegemite notes in this cheese. And what I get in between is this beautiful balance. And it's not actually a flavor I think I've ever experienced before.
Yeah, and I think that's it's interesting. Nikki Donald earlier posted which cheese would go with a Goes. Now, Goes is made from originated in Leipzig, which is and one of the signature flavors of it Goes is the saltiness, and the sprocket does pair really well. But she actually has got me intrigued a little bit about, or he has got me intrigued about, whether or not the salty beer would actually go quite well with this as well. So maybe a bit later, we're still hanging out, we'll rack out a few of those and we'll see if how that saltiness might actually work quite well with the beer as well. And I think that's something when you're doing beer and food matching, is that a lot of the time there can be quite a few different beers that match well with the same food, or in this case, the same cheese. So, I mean, I agree. I think the sprocket does go really well with this. It is quite a strong flavour. It needs something stronger to, compare. The bitterness, certainly, once again, beer and cheese, always that creaminess, richness, balanced with the bitterness or the dryness of the beer. But also, I think the tropical notes sort of add a little interesting character to match that. Yeah, Mike, you said it was Vegemite, or Vegemite in beer world is a bit about sort of an off flavour that we don't really want in our beer. It's when we've left it too long on the yeast and it becomes autolyzed, the yeast. So, but I think we might look at that Gozer a bit later and see how that goes well with this cheese as well. Certainly, the salty character of this cheese is something that always enhances flavour in beer. I mean, it has been known that some brewers actually add a bit of salt to their beer all the time, for every batch. We don't, but salt and cheese.
Well, actually, I think the next pairing that's coming up, which we'll talk about shortly, is probably what I think would be the best pairing to go with the Goetze. So we'll chat through that shortly. But first, half of you guys actually have a different cheese that I haven't spoken about yet, and that's called Mimolette. Back, I think it was 17th century, Emperor King Louis XIV actually ordered this cheese to be made as a result of Dutch Edam cheese, which was growing with massive fame in Europe. There's actually a lot of history. The French are known for being famous for cheese, but if you've done any of our previous events, you hear me talk about Gruyere, which was actually the inspiration for France to create Comté, because Gruyere was getting way too prominent in in Europe, and Dutch Edam was actually going to such fame so rapidly that Louis ordered or arranged for Mimolette to be created, sent spies into the Netherlands to actually look at the manufacturing of it and tried to replicate it himself. So because Edam, which is actually a little bit similar in notes to this Gouda, it's a very orangey cheese, which is very characteristic for the Netherlands. Originally, they actually put carrot juice into the mix of making Mimolette to make it orange, just to try and replicate that Dutch Edam experience. In the end, they ended up changing that and putting in, it's actually a Mexican spice that they use now to give it the orange color. But what's really interesting about this cheese is its aging process. And so for 8 months of the year, on average, sitting in its wooden shelves in its cellars, it's actually deliberately infected with mites on the rind, the external surface of the cheese. And the reason that's done is because those mites actually help to instigate certain bacteria, and they also actually help to bring in a certain flavor characteristic into the cheese. And those, sort of caramel Vegemite tones that I talked about before, you're going to get the same tones in this cheese. And a lot of those in this particular one, the Mimolette, are brought on by those mites. It sounds completely disgusting. There's cheeses around the world that are made with missions and things to bring on certain flavors. Mites definitely up there in terms of...
We've made beers with maggots too. So.
Awesome. We'll have to try that one later. But every week during the aging process, people go in and dust the mites off this cheese. And then by the time they go back a week later, it's completely full of mites again. They do that for a lot of the process. And then eventually they do a particular heat process that gets rid of the mites. Nonetheless, a few years back, the US government actually stopped the importation of this cheese, and for a brief moment stopped the importation of dairy products from France into the US because of this mite infestation process, which was deemed under their laws illegal. Weirdly, there is a law on how many mites per square inch you can have, and it's actually 6 mites per square inch. I guess relating that to COVID, you could say that the social distancing of mites was not actually being monitored very well on this particular cheese. So it caused a bit of a ruckus in the US in an importation. But fortunately, they had to change a few things, but everything got sorted. And this is now one of the, a huge popular exported cheese out of France.
Mike, I'm liking this cheese without the cracker, though. I reckon for some reason, I find in this particular cheese, I really just want to have that cheese by itself. I don't want that cracker with it.
Yep.
Any thoughts on why that is, or that's just something that's particularly palate?
No, that's not at all. And I actually agree. With a lot of hard cheeses, particularly ones that have a really full-bodied flavour, I prefer them with no cracker, no bread, and actually, I think a lot of these French and Swiss hard cheeses particularly go really well just with a little bit of relish, or even sometimes just a sprig of rosemary. And crackers sometimes can actually take a bit of the flavour away from the cheese, and you don't want that. I mean, particularly if you're doing something like this, you want to get the best experience and the best flavour characteristics out of the cheese. But yeah, if you got some of these cheeses left over, try them with different condiments. You got some quince paste in your box. I think that personally goes best with the soft cheeses. A rosemary bush at home. If you got some good tomato and onion relish at home, try it with these cheeses, because I actually think that's a pairing on its own that brings out different characteristics of the cheese and works really well.
And I think that's the thing when you're tasting a lot of beers as well, is that it's important to break up those flavours that you're tasting. And I think the thing I noticed when we swapped over from the crankshaft to the sprocket was that I needed a bit of cheese in there to just balance that palate out. And then when we start again with the sprocket, I've got a different feel of bitterness. Justin's got a good question up there, though. And do beers and cheeses from the same European regions tend to go better together. Interesting question. It looks like we might have to get 20 different beers and 20 different cheeses from different countries and sit around and work that one out.
I'm all right with that.
It is a good question. I honestly can't answer that. I actually don't know the answer to that. I would imagine that there is certainly. I'm not sure people have made different cheeses to match beers, or I'm not sure brewers have brewed different beers to match the cheeses. I just wonder if just being in the same town and being in the same surroundings, maybe there's some similarity in growing from the grass to the barley. Obviously, the grass, the cows are digesting, or the goats are digesting, or the sheep are digesting to make cheese, versus the malt that the brewers are using. Because it's amazing how certain flavours can travel all the way from, ground to glass, and that's like the salt. The salt obviously influencing the cheese, influencing the beer as well. So, Justin, I can't really answer that one. I think we'll have to do a little in-house tasting and work that one out together. I think that's probably the best answer I can give.
I can actually add to that a little bit, where if you ask a cheese or a beer manufacturer in a region, so say you go to the Netherlands and you ask someone who makes cheese in the Netherlands, a Dutch cheeses and Dutch beer is going to go best together. Of course, same with France. And they all have such different characteristics from each other. But personally, for someone who does get 20 beers and 20 cheeses together, I think you can pair things from different regions just fine. But there is actually a history of beers being made for cheeses and cheeses being made for beers, particularly in Belgium. The old Belgian monks in monasteries dating back centuries actually have been manufacturing beer cheese, and specifically to be able to pair it with the beers that they were making in their monasteries. And that's actually a really good story from the Isle of Mull of Scotland, where there's only one cheese farm on the Isle of Mull, and they make a fantastic Scottish cheddar. It's hard to get in this country. I used to be able to get it in. I can't get it anymore. But if you ever see Isle of Mull Scottish cheddar, get it. It's phenomenal. And the reason why it's so good is being made using milk from what is called in Scotland drunk cows. And because there's one cheese farm on the island, there's also one whiskey distillery in the island, and the cows actually are fed the spelt grain that comes from the whiskey distillery, and so hence they're called drunk cows. And it's designed the cheese is designed to be able to pair with their whiskey, and it goes phenomenally. It's such a great
there's
pairing.
plenty of drunk cows and plenty of drunk sheep around Canberra, so why can't we make some cheeses like that?
Let's do it. Maybe that's going to be the next birthday special. Someone's actually just popped a question. I'm not sure of a name, but they said the Gouda rind is so intense. Why is that?
Yeah.
And well, it's a natural rind, but it's just so hard. And I think part of it is actually down to that aging process, where I said, particularly in the hot room, it actually makes that rind just solidify it so much in actually a shorter time than usual. So you can eat it, but for this one and also for the next pairing, I actually just think the rinds are a bit too hard. And so when you get to that, you're actually losing the characteristics of the cheese.
Yeah, I agree. I think some rinds, like the soft ones, obviously are really signature to the cheese, but some of these hard ones, and just tasting a bit of this one now, I reckon it detracts from the flavour of the cheese. So should eat that one.
Yeah. It's a bit hard to swallow, but your soft cheeses like the Daffamar we had before. No one's lying here. The bit in the middle, the creamy bit, is definitely the best bit of the cheese. But in France, if you just scrape out that bit, you'll get kicked out of the country. It's offensive. But I mean, as with soft cheeses, with hard cheeses, in the middle, you're going to get the best bits, the best characteristics. Yeah. And that's just partly due to the aging process and how proteins and how fat, the weight of proteins and fats actually, group together in cheeses. And so you're always going to get much more renounced flavors in the center.
Maybe one of the reasons why I like cheese so much is because cheese is actually fattier for you than beer. And so you feel like
Sure
you're going
is.
on a diet when you're drinking beer.
Yeah, no,
Well, I think we should funk it up a little bit.
Let's
we
do
move
it.
into this next one.
Sounds good.
We've got Mother Funker. You got your little can over the back there next to the crankshaft. And we're pairing this with Midnight Moon. That's an interesting name.
It is, yeah. And in all honesty, I can't actually tell you where the name comes from, or why it's called Midnight Moon. But I'll kick off with the cheese. And so Midnight Moon, for me, as I was talking about before, this is the perfect example of a good Dutch cheese. So the same style as a Gouda or a Gouda, but it's a goat's milk version. And that is one thing that the Netherlands does phenomenally. And so to me, it's aged at the absolute perfect age where it's just starting to get a little bit crunchy. You might be lucky to get some of those little salty, tyrosine cream up before. But it's just got such a beautifully balanced flavor. And this one actually contradicts a little bit what I was saying before, where the center is always going to be better than closer to the rind. I actually find the consistency of this cheese to be so good from edge to edge. It's almost, to me, a perfect cheese. And actually quite an interesting one, because this one was commissioned by a dairy in the United States. So they tried for a long time to actually make a Dutch Gouda, particularly a goat's cheese one. And as much as they tried, similar to what I was talking about a little bit with Australian manufacturing, they couldn't quite get it right, partly due to altitudes, due to climates, different cows, different goats. Like there's lots of different factors that can change the flavor, but they couldn't get it right. So they commissioned this dairy in northern Holland, not too far from Amsterdam, to manufacture a Dutch Gouda specifically for them. And it actually very, very quickly won gold in the World Cheese Awards, and now is just completely available internationally because it's such a phenomenal cheese. So I think when I talk about Dutch cheese being part of the inspiration of the Cheesesmith, because we couldn't get flavors like good Dutch cheese in Australia, this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of flavor that I want that I couldn't get, and this is part of the reason why I started importing cheese.
Cool. Well, Mother Funker, this is the beer that we've specially canned just for you. It's not available out there in the world in cans apart from you guys out there. So it's a really special beer. It was a beer we started. It was the start of our barrel aging program. We started that sort of a year after we started, and you have to be patient. You have to take your time. Most beers you make, you want to be drinking within 2 weeks of canning. I think we canned this sprocket last week, so it's pretty fresh. But this beer we brewed sort of in April last year, and we fermented the beer. We then moved the beer into our barrels, which have our house sort of bacteria culture, and those barrels have had that bacteria culture in them for 5 years. So the beer's only a bit over 14 months old, but the microbes and the bacteria that have infused this beer and made all these beautiful flavours we're about to taste have been there for 5 years. So we basically, when the beer's in the barrel and all those bacteria are growing, they develop what's called a big layer of mould on top called a pellicule. It can get pretty thick. And what we do is that pellicule sort of protects the beer from any outside sort of influences like oxygen. And we let that beer sit there. When we rack that beer out and put it into a tank ready for processing into kegs or cans, all that pellicule just relaxes down the sides of that barrel. We always have fresh beer ready to pump straight into that barrel, float it all back up and reuse all that bacteria. Some of the bacteria that we use, like the lactobacillus and especially the pediococcus, really are temperature dependent. And it's really important that they go through at least 4 seasons. So for us in Canberra, in April, it's starting to get a bit cooler. The bacteria start to just hibernate a little bit, but still grow. And as we come out the other side, sort of October, November, they really start to, expand and produce all these great flavours. And then the heat of January really gets that sweaty horse blanket. That's one of the signature flavours, certainly of this beer, but also a lot of sour beers, and it's because of that temperature change, and that quite a sudden temperature change. Really, we've gone from, I remember one of my first in the late 90s, we had a frost in December. There was snow falling up on the snowies, and yet then all of a sudden we have these 40-degree days. So you have that sudden temperature shift. The bacteria starts to really do its thing and change, and that's one of the reasons why I think this beer is something that's, it's quite signature to this beer. You certainly get a lot of that sweaty horse blanket characters, those acidic characters, musty characters. I like to call it the zoo-like characters. You've got a bit of everything in there. You've got a little bit from the chicken coop, a little bit from the horse stable, a little bit from the pig pen. They're all in there together, all working together to produce really awesome flavours. And the other thing is that these bacteria produce a little bit of acidity. So you've got a much better cleansing sort of beer in front of you. And I think that's probably why this works well with this pair. This is the second or third time I think we've done this sour beer. Maybe the second time with this particular cheese.
Second time we did it once with a different sour.
Yeah.
But someone asked a question before, and I can't remember who it was, but they asked about pairing cheese with Goses, which is actually a Belgian word for sour beer. And I think
Nicky Donald.
Yeah. So this cheese is beer, and I'm hoping you guys are experiencing it as we speak. But it was actually, I did go through a lot of different types of cheese with sour beers, and sometimes you get pairings that are almost there, but this one is just a match made in heaven for me. I mean, it's one of my favorite cheeses, a brilliant cheese, but I am actually personally someone who doesn't drink a lot of sour beer, and when I first paired these two beers together in particular, I grew a much bigger appreciation for sour beer, and now I regularly have this cheese with sour beer at home.
The other bacteria that I didn't mention earlier that's in this beer is a bacteria called Acetobacter, and it's actually the big enemy of making sour beer. A lot of breweries, when they're making sour beer, end up with barrels that just have tons of Acetobacter in them. And our barrels definitely have a little bit, but we like to keep it under control. And Acetobacter is the bacteria that produces vinegar. And when you really taste this beer and you get a little bit on the back of the palate, you get that slight vinegary note, and that's sort of part of that cleansing and part of that digesting some of those that sweaty sort of character that's come up at the front. And I think that's why this beer does certainly provide that cleansing part to this partnership, because that little bit of sort of vinegary character, of sourness and acidity at the back just cleans it out and makes me want to go and have another piece.
Yeah, I can just keep rolling on. This is a particularly salty cheese. So for that question before, this is a perfect example. Salty cheese, sour beers, they just go great together. And it's interesting, you were talking about temperature changes as well, or how temperature affects beer aging. And temperature is everything with cheese aging. And even to the point where, before I was talking about aging cheese in wooden boxes, the wood that is used for those wooden boxes, if it's harvested in the summer, there's too much moisture in the wood. And so it won't actually age the cheese right. It will stain the cheese. You'll start to develop different bacteria that you don't want. There's wooden boxes, which are actually similar to these little ones behind me here. If this wood is aged in the winter, it's a lot drier and actually provides that perfect little microclimate for the beer to develop its correct bacteria in. It's that finicky, and that's just one small stage of the aging process, essentially, for cheese. Yeah.
Everyone's loving this pairing, Mike. I'm pretty loving it too. We could just probably sit here and digest this. We're going to have to. I'm just starting to think about losing everyone or anyone who's on Insta. We've got 10 more minutes. I reckon we can knock out maybe one more pairing and maybe even come back to this pairing after the next one.
Yeah, sure.
So we've got another sour beer. The cheese is there's a little bit of similarity, but it's still obviously very different. So why don't we leave this glass here? We'll get a couple more fresh glasses. We'll pour the pour the beer into those and look at this next cheese.
Sounds good. And just while we're at it too, I mean, we're going to have a break soon, but I encourage you guys, if you have enough, to try different cheeses with different beers, and get an experience of what I do when I bring these cheeses down to BentSpoke and go through the entire selection, because it'll actually help you, I think, to understand why we've paired certain beers with certain cheeses, because particularly this beer, sour beer, is a great example where it really won't go with a lot of styles of cheese. And so by doing that, just experiment yourself, see what you think, see what notes you get, send us some comments, send us some questions from what you experienced from that. But hopefully you'll understand the reasons why we've chosen the pairings we have, why they go together so well.
Well, the next pairing is controversial, potentially from the beer side. So maybe you should go first with the next pairing, Mike.
Sure.
No rush. When you're ready.
I'm always ready to talk about cheese. Actually, I'm just going to bounce to Capital Food Adventure, who put up a comment saying they're loving the stories behind cheese and beer pairings, and cheese to eat in a month. That's a good question, and I would say a lot more than your average person. We
might have to have a bit of a cheese off.
Let's do it. All right, well, we're going to have a live competition. Let's see who can eat the most cheese. And maybe, I know if it's who can drink the most beer, I definitely know who's going to win that one.
Well, we're pacing ourselves, and it's important that we do leave a little bit behind because, like you just said, we want to try different beers with the different cheeses as well.
Yeah.
And I think everyone out there should do that as well because everyone's palate's a little bit different. And you guys might find a different beer goes better with a different cheese. And that's exactly right. We'd love to hear about it too, because I think our cheese and beer sessions sometimes last a bit too long. So we do take notes. We take good notes, so we know what we're doing the next day. But I think it's just amazing to have this big wheel of flavour, all the beers over here and all the cheese flavours over here, and we're blending to work out how it all works. Mike, we put together our selection, but you guys out there might actually do something a bit different, and that's great. That's not wrong. It's perfectly awesome. So we're going to do that a bit later because that's why we've still got a bit left of every beer.
Yeah, and the reality is everyone's taste buds are different. So you guys are probably going to like different beers, different cheeses, and find combinations that work for you. And if that's the case, yeah, please let us know because I love that kind of feedback so I can think about different pairings of cheeses in the future.
Talk about the cheese.
How much time have we got before Insta? We've got nothing. So this cheese is actually a super exciting cheese. This is a really rare one to get in Australia. And the reason why I've paired this cheese with this beer is because both of them are actually based off an original Flemish or Belgian technique in terms of manufacturing both beer and cheese. And so this one is called Gellerhocker, which literally translates to sitting in a cellar. So Belgians, dating back to the ancient monasteries, everybody aged in a cellar because that's where the cooler climates were. So meat was stored in a cellar, cheese was aged in a cellar, beer was made in cellars. In fact, for those of you who don't know, cheese was essentially invented by storing something in a cellar. And ironically, back in the day before plastic bags and such, they used to use cows' stomachs as a sort of bladder for storing milk, which sounds horrendously disgusting. Sorry for any vegetarians out there. But by doing that and by unfortunately just leaving it on the shelf a little bit too long in the cellar, they came back and the result was cheese. They found cheese. And that's because all of those microbes, all of those things that are inside the cow's stomach had worked with the milk, processed the milk, and created something that then formed essentially what is the cheese industry we know today. And so this cheese, I'm going to show it to you, is one of my favorite cheeses because look at how amazing that is. Now, I don't know how well you can see that. I'm even a bit closer. But it actually says Gellerhocker on the side of it. It has this amazing graphics on the front. It's actually, this is a very traditional cheese in terms of how it's made and how it looks, but it's actually a very new, and it's actually a cheesemaker from Switzerland in the Appenzell region. If anyone's ever had Appenzeller before, it's kind of another version of Comté or Gruyere, but made with a secret brine recipe that they wash the outside of the cheese with every single day during its aging process. Now, that's a common thing to do, but the Appenzell region are famous for their secret recipes. It's like the secret 5 herbs and spices. And this cheese is similar, has a secret recipe. They wash it every day and flip it upside down. Do that for about 24 months. And the combination of the altitude, the secret recipe that they use, creates a very different characteristic of cheese that is different to Appenzeller and Gruyere, which are also made in Switzerland. But it's quite a punchy one. You can eat the rind of this one because it is a naturally forming rind, but it's going to have a kick to it. It's got a pungent smell, but it's a very quite a potent cheese, but I think it's a really good match with this one, particularly because both of them are based on this rather ancient monasterial Belgian technique.
This is based on a Belgian beer. I think I've got like half a minute, so I'll talk about this beer, which is our Flanders Red. It's a combination of a couple of 2-year-old barrels, 1-year-old barrels, and some fresh Flemish red beer. And I got inspired by this type of formula from going and visiting Rodenbach, which is a famous brewery in Belgium. And I think that the main things about this type of beer is that it's actually very make. It's actually very hard to actually get it right. You've got beer that you sit around for 2 years, beer that you sit around for 1 year. You have all the acidity, you have all the bacterial characters, and then you blend a bit of fresh beer into that, and you freshen it up with some really nice estery characters, which are generally fruity characters that come from the yeast, as well as some really sort of rich malt characters. I think the thing with this beer is it's probably one of the first Flanders Red style beer in a can, and the idea about this beer was not to try and copy or mimic closely Rodenbach. It was to actually get a beer like this in the can that people could actually. It wanted to be approachable. I wanted people to able to go into their bottle shop and actually purchase this beer at a decent price, but not spend $60 on a champagne bottle for this beer. Generally, these beers are aged in champagne bottles, packed in champagne bottles. I wanted to make it accessible to people who are getting into their, getting on the journey. And that was the thing about this beer. I think for a few people, it's not the same as Rodenbach. Well, the style of Flemish Red can range from anywhere from lower alcohols to higher alcohols. It doesn't need to be the 8% massive wow factor that Rodenbach is. And I'm on my journey as a brewer to try and brew these beers so I'm not ready to make an 8% Flanders Red beer. I'm ready to get a beer out there that can be accessible to people, can be a bit of a start to someone's craft beer journey in terms of going to the sour side. Anyway, Flem the name. Flem was a guy who we left the brewery so wowed, needed a beer, walked into the town, sat at a brasserie 100 metres away from Rodenbach, couldn't speak any Flemish, didn't know what beers we should have. Flem was a farmer sitting at the bar. That's right, his name was Flem. And he helped us out. He gave us some beers, so we've named this beer after him. I think this pairing is going to be really interesting to match those Flemish characters. We're going to see you in about 10 minutes, and you're going to have a quiz on the way pretty soon.
We're about to lose our Instagram family, so we're going to have a quick break, and we're going to come back in a couple of minutes. So try different things, send us some questions. Those who have already sent us questions, we're going to come back to those later. Don't worry, you haven't missed out.
Oh.
Yeah.
The first people to answer each question in a separate comment wins a merch pack. So you could win 5 merch, know all the answers. First question. What 3 countries are tonight's cheese all from? The second question. What does 0606 mean to BentSpoke? The third question. What is used cheese? The fourth question. What year was BentSpoke founded? And the fifth and final question. What are 2 of the reasons it is hard for Australians to replicate European cheese? We'll just quickly run through those questions one more time. What 3 countries are tonight's cheeses from? Question 2. What does 0606 mean to BentSpoke? Question 3. What is used to age Mimolette cheese? Question 4. What year was BentSpoke founded? And for the fifth and final question, what are 2 of the reasons it is hard for Australians to replicate European cheese styles? Well, I hope everyone's really enjoyed the session so far tonight. I know this is a big part of the BentSpoke birthday celebrations. We've had a big week. This is a highlight for us, and we love that Mike the Cheesesmith can come down again for another event. This time we do it online and we do it around the country. Really excited for the rest of the birthday celebrations at the Brew Pub tomorrow. We've got a beer launch at 11 a.m. from the Brew Pub. It'll be available, shipped around the country and all of our great retailers everywhere. I think I can see Mike and Rich coming over from the distance. I know I'm excited to try the next 2 cheeses and hopefully have a round 3 again because I didn't think I had quite enough. So here they come. Looking forward to it.
So, Mike, why do you reckon this beer works really well with this cheese? I mean, obviously similar sort of history origins.
Yeah. Well, that bounces back to a question we had before about cheeses and beers or things coming from the same region, and are they the best to pair with each other? Well, this for me is a good example of that. And even though this cheese is actually not made in Belgium, and this beer is certainly not made in Belgium, it's made in Canberra. This cheese is made in Switzerland. But nonetheless, both of them are inspired by a particular, rather ancient technique. And so that's why I particularly wanted to try and pair these cheeses together. And when I tasted it, it was a bit of a match made in heaven again. And for me, this cheese is a punchy cheese. It's a really good example of a classic European aged hard cheese that is aged in a rather moist environment. Particularly, you really get this sort of moldy. It's like, Rich was talking about sweaty horse blankets in sours before. This is the cheese equivalent of that for me. You get a punch in the back of the throat that I don't think I get from any other food group. And when I have this beer, which is considering the darkness of the color, for me, it's actually a really light, refreshing beer. Strangely, it kind of takes the punch of that cheese away. And I think if you were to have, I guess everyone pretty much got a block about that size of this cheese. And if you cheese by itself, after itself, without having anything else, by the end of it, it would be pretty hard to eat. It's really punchy. But when you interject it with this beer every time, they work really well together as a pairing. And that's why, for me, pairings are things that I can continue and not have too many characteristics of one or too many characteristics of the other overpowering. I think they come together really beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this cheese has got the biggest depth of flavour that we've had tonight. For me, it's got when you have a bit of cheese, this is one of the cheeses where you just take a little bit of it and let it just move around over your palate. You get the salty, you get the sour. You certainly get those aromas coming out of this cheese as well.
It's pungent.
And I think the Flemish style red ale or Flam really does enhance that. There's so many comparable flavours, I think, in this beer. I'm actually probably struggling to find a lot of contrasting flavours. The only contrast, I think, in this beer is there's a little bit of tannin from some of the red wine barrels that we used. And I think that does actually add a bit of good flavour in terms of the matching to the cheese. This doesn't have a lot of bitterness, this beer. It's obviously got a bit of sourness, but a bit of that tannin and a bit of that sourness really do work really well with this cheese. I think it's a bit of a hit. And I'm sure Flem would have liked it too if I'd given him some of this at the bar.
I wish I met him. But can I actually ask a question just to someone who's curious? What's the advantage of aging in oak barrels?
Yeah, look, oak barrels are, when you're comparing oak barrels to stainless steel tanks, oak barrels are sort of a medium they're slightly porous, so they're allowing integration from the outside.
Yeah.
And the bacteria really like a bit of oxygen to keep growing and keep developing flavours. And it's definitely a much different beer. And we're not talking about getting any flavours from the barrel. Right. Barrels can provide different flavours as well. So we've got a beer coming up that's aged in a signature barrel, which we'll talk about soon. But even if you age beer in red wine barrels or white wine barrels, whether you've got American oak, French oak, I'm actually not looking at getting any of those flavours. I'm actually looking at using the barrel as a interface between the bacteria and the outside.
Right.
And our barrels generally, they're always going to build up a bit of local bacteria on the barrel and then eventually get into the barrel. So those local bacteria are going to develop flavours as well. I mean, the famous sour beer breweries, if you think of some of the breweries, obviously Rodenbach, but I really think about Cantillon in Brussels, and they do a lot of spontaneous fermentation. So they make the beer, they put it in a cool ship, which is like a really shallow bath. They leave it for overnight, potentially longer, and the natural bacteria, the natural yeast in the air comes in, infuses into that beer, and that's actually what ferments that beer. And they've been doing that for so long in their place that barn that they're in has so much local or so much Cantillon sort of flavour, so many microbes flying around in that barn that every time that they do brew their beer, which they only brew a very short period of time each year and then age it for 12 months, they get these really signature flavours. And I think what we're talking about these signature flavours that come from a region, but also come from the process as well. I'm sure, a cheese like this isn't a simple process. How old did you say this one was as well?
How old did you say? 24 months?
So it's a 2-year-old cheese.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, most local supermarkets don't have too many old cheeses, but aged cheeses, sorry. But
well, actually, a lot of people ask me, how do I select good cheeses from the supermarket? And for me, with hard cheeses, it's you want to find the most the longest age possible. So you'll see sometimes in supermarkets, you'll see Gruyere, you'll see Comté, but they'll probably be 3-month aged. If you're lucky, 6-month aged. A good proper Comté or Gruyere will be 24 to 36-month age. That's the sort of range we're talking about here, and so it is possible. You just want to look for the longest aged hard cheese you can get, because if it's only 3 months old, then they're probably going to use an accelerated process to age that cheese and make it hard. Soft cheeses, similarly, for me, soft cheeses from a supermarket, we talked before about soft cheeses oozing on the plate. The only way you're going to get that from a supermarket cheese is if it's really close to the best before date. And I'm going to say something controversial here with that, in that Australian production laws with dairy vary from French law, and in a way that from the manufactured, our production laws say that it needs to be this long after manufacture date, whereas French law is about 3 weeks after that. And so even though a lot of Australian cheese manufacturers are using the same processes, we just have different laws, and we have a very tightly regulated food industry. And it's good because obviously we don't have a lot of health issues in relation to food poisoning. But what it means for me is if you want to get a good soft cheese from a supermarket, personally, I'd be getting it as close as you can to the best before date and keeping it in the fridge till probably 2 to 3 weeks after the best before date. And that's when the French would say is the perfect time to eat it.
There you go. Well, a beer like this, it's amazing when you're actually racking barrels and you take the 2-year-old barrels and the 1-year-old barrels and the fresh beer and you pull a bit of a sample of each and you try and sort of combine it together and try and work out, do you want more of the 2 or more of the 1 or more of the fresh? And in the end, this beer just took equal parts because that was actually the best blend that we did. You think the 2-year would be better, but in actual fact, the 2-year needed a bit of freshness, and the 1 year was like the moderator.
Yeah.
So it's like a 2-year over here. Yeah. 1 year is the court, and the fresh beer over here, and they all work really well together to lift it to another level. So I think. Yeah, I mean, beer aging isn't complete exact science of how it all works. It depends on the temperature and the weather that we get through those times. It depends on, I guess, how old the barrels are as well, because the older the barrels are, the more that they've been used, the less porous they get because all those pores fill up with, tannin if you're talking wine, or they fill up with yeast and bacteria from the beer. So,
how long did it take you to develop this beer? Just out of curiosity.
Well, this is the first time we've done this Flanders Red. We've certainly had beer in barrels for a long period of time.
Yeah, sure.
And we've been doing barrel aged beers for sort of 5 years. And I sort of journey in brewing is sort of back in the early 2002s.
Yeah.
Started doing barrel aging beer in Australia with Brad Rogers from Stone and Wood and Brendan Barris from Ferrell. And I think we were the first brewers in Australia to do barrel aged beer. We sort of all did it at the same time. But Mike, you're going to have to go back and watch Barrels Season Part 2 on the Brewers Bent Brewers Live, because we talked all about that back then. I think we should move on to the last beer.
Yeah, well, just in between, we've actually got a couple of questions that we might roll over.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, sure. So. Actually, so Bren Ev asked, is there any reason why there are no blue cheese pairings? Yes, there is actually, Bren. And part of it is because, for me, the blue cheeses that I want to pair with these beers are too hard to wrap. So blue cheese ranges from really soft to quite crumbly. And the crumbly cheeses, I guess a lot of them are quite pungent, but for me, the real good blue cheeses are the ones that are quite soft. And so and send them out to you guys. By the time they get to you and you open them, it's going to be a bit of a mess. That's the first reason. The other reason is blue cheese is controversial in a sense that probably 50% of the room likes it, 50% of the room doesn't. Now, those cheeses that I like using, I call the converters, because when someone tells me they don't like blue cheese, I'm on a mission to find the blue cheese that they like. And these ones are always winners. They're fantastic. But they're just a little bit hard to wrap. And that's the only reason why you don't have a blue cheese today. But we've actually done blue cheeses in our pairings before. And usually I do pair them with BentSpoke's more Belgian examptions because blue cheese is punchy.
I think the alcohol, you don't need the fruity hop flavours to they don't work well with blue cheese. I think the Belgian characters, like you say, the estery characters, some of the phenolic characters, alcohol, they're really good with blue cheese. The alcohol especially is doing that cleanse thing with the blue cheese. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Justin's had a good question up there for a little bit and probably going to win something tonight, I reckon. It's a bloody good question. How well do microbes used in aging cheeses play with barrel-aged beers? Can they be friends? So basically what I think he's saying, can we make a beer out of bacteria from cheese? Yeah. Or could you make cheese out of a bacteria from beer? Now, I'm going to give that a go.
Well, Jim's actually got a similar
I've already
question.
Been thinking about in my head how we can make this happen. So we need to start, we'll talk about that, and we'll look at trying to age a beer for 12 months using cheese bacteria. And I'm pretty confident we'll get something out of it. Because a little bit of research I did before the show tonight was a lot of the bacteria that are on cheeses are a lot of those wild bacteria that are obviously found around in the air. Yeah. They're not bacteria that are spoilers to beer. So I think they could be quite complementary. I think we'll do a little test run, and I think then we can step it up into a bigger run.
Yeah,
okay?
I think it's going to take a bit of testing. Some cheeses are actually aged in the air. In particularly in high altitude areas, they're aged on a shelf, not in a controlled climate room at all. They're actually just aged in a cellar, or in some not in a cellar, in quite an open air environment where they're picking up those bacteria from the local environment. And yeah, I think we can hone in on that. And Jim Hennessy had basically the same question about, can you make cheese with beer or can you make beer with cheese? So the Belgians, as I said before, have been making cheese with beer for centuries, aging them in their cellars. You can, if you ever go to Belgium, with beer cheese, because it's great. It has those harsh characteristics that this last cheese has, a lot of depth, but then you do actually get some of those Belgian beer characteristics coming through, and it's phenomenal. But beer,
would that be also about, though, maybe infusing beer with sort of hops? I know that we got some nice hops down here, and they have all those great sort of lupulin characters which house all the oils, and getting a nice soft cheese like this one here and cutting it in half and layering it all with hops, and then sitting that for a couple of weeks and just letting all those hop oils, which will work well with the fat. So the fat will pick up those hop oils and put those flavours into the cheese. If you've never actually done that, I have done that with camembert, actually with brie as well. You can cut it in half, layer it with hops, put it back together, wrap it up nice and tight, and it's coming into your brie or your camembert, and it does work really well. I think I probably need to grab Mike and we'll get a better cheese maybe to do it with. But what about also using beer? Potentially in the making of cheese, an additional character to the. I mean, we talk about obviously hops and using some of the ingredients, but actually using some of the beer, putting that in one of the first stages there where you're actually doing the churn.
It could be possible. It'll be interesting to see how the curds actually respond to it. To go back on what you were saying before, there's actually cheeses in France, which one of which I get in to the country. It's a Dauphinois, similar to what you guys had in the first pairing tonight, that is aged in a cave, and they age it in the cave for about a month, and then they cut it lengthways, cut it in half, and insert truffle into it, shavings of truffle, wrap it back up, chuck it in the cave for another month, and then it's ready to go. And what it does is the actual the pate, the center of the cheese, completely extracts those truffle flavors out, and it's a phenomenal cheese. Only available here around Christmas time, just because of the seasons over there. But
we could do that.
I think we could do that with hops.
Yeah, because I'm using a bit of truffle at the moment in one of our beers, and the glutamate in the truffle really does flavour enhance the characters of the beer. So we're infusing our beer with citrus in the way of mandarin, and we've got 5 spices, not 5 different spices, cinnamon, cloves, some juniper berries. What else have we got in there? Some nutmeg. We've infused the beer through that citrus and the cloves and the spices, and the truffle that we've added really brings those flavours together. And I've noticed when we've lit a truffle and used it at home occasionally, and it's amazing. What you do is you put the truffle, and everyone knows truffle in your packet of eggs, and the truffle's so strong that it'll seek out any fatty part, so it actually goes through the shell of the egg and infuses your eggs and into the yolk, and you make the best scrambled eggs with truffle. So good.
You should try it.
And you just keep sticking the truffle in, and you keep churning out the eggs. It's really easy. Well, I think we might move on to our last pairing. Jason's got a good question. We'll come back to Jason a bit later, but I think we'll go through to our last pairing so we can start to sip and savour and all the last questions that are coming through.
Sounds good.
So this last beer, I don't think anyone's tasted it yet.
This is a new one, right?
This is a new one.
This is exciting.
You and me tonight, tasting it for the first time.
Let's do it.
So we're gonna. This is truly telling everyone about a beer they've never had. Well, actually, everyone out there's probably already tasted and finished it.
You guys probably had it long ago. And sorry, we're talking way too much. But that's what we do. We love talking about beer and cheese.
I think you got a spare glass over there. So
I do. So this is Descent 20, obviously, because it's the last one you guys have got, if you haven't already gotten to it.
And did you know that our first birthday beer we did was Descent 15?
Right.
It was in 2015. So I thought I'd make a 15% beer. Second year we went to 60. Third year we went to 17%. Fourth year we said this isn't going anywhere good. And I also thought about the can, and I thought, Jesus, imagine charging someone $582 for a pack. It wouldn't work. So we ended up going, all right, how are we going to change this beer? How are we going to lift this beer? How are we still going to make it accessible for people? It is 10%, so it's not light. I think the alcohol is very well hidden in this particular beer. But what we did was we got some bourbon barrels in, famous sort of bourbon distillery in the US called Maker's Mark. We brought some of those barrels in, and we've aged this beer in these barrels for the last few years. And I think the first year, like last year, was quite bourbony, a lot of vanilla. We didn't quite get the bitterness perfect in the beer, so it's a little bit out of balance, even though it wasn't a bad beer.
Yeah.
But this year, I think what's happened is we've got a nice bit of bourbon character, a nice bit of vanilla character. We've also got some wild yeast characters that have come in with the barrels a bit of time. And so we've sort of got a bit of that sort of funky, I love the word sweaty character in the beer. But then you've also got all these rich malts as well. So you've got the roast barley. You've got that sort of burnt sort of coffee bean character that you get when someone doesn't grind their coffee too good. But I actually quite like it in a beer. And so complex, interesting, not only flavours going on in the beer, but techniques to actually get the beer to our glass here. And this cheese you've got an interesting technique too about how we're going to taste this cheese.
Yeah,
You're going to hold your glass there? Or are you going to...
well, sure. Yeah, so the last cheese that you guys have is called Tête de Moine. Anyone who speaks French will know that actually translates to the head of a monk. And the reason is, I think I can probably show you this, even though it's a little bit difficult. But the way that this cheese comes is in a cylinder, which is just under a kilo. And the reason it got its name is not only did it kind of look like the head of a monk, because I don't know if you've watched Vikings, but traditionally the monks have that sort of bald patch, which presumably gets a bit sunburned because this one's a bit red. I'm not there yet, but it's coming. But also rumor has it that in the little town where this is made, one particular monk who was the one trying to sell this and get this around the town had a particular smell that came from his head and from the hair around his bald patch, and the pungent smell of this cheese reflected the smell that came from his head. It's called the monk's head for two reasons: because of the look and because of the smell. Now, this cheese is actually from the 14th century, and a rather remarkable...
600 years old.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And the same recipe is still used today. It's got a washed rind, but what's actually amazing about this cheese is that the rind is a natural formed rind, which we've talked about before, but it is designed for you to... Now, unfortunately for you guys at home, you don't all have the same contraption to be able to eat this in the way that it's designed to eat, but it's designed to eat using what's called a girole. And now this is a cheese shaver. And so because as we were talking about before, where the inside of the cheese is always going to have the most balanced, this cheese is designed to eat with some of the middle, some of the outside, and actually balanced in exactly the right order. And the only way to do that is actually to shave the cheese like this, which gets you basically the exact proportions that you want to be able to balance those flavors. If you have too much of the rind, Rich is just hoping to catch some of this so that he can eat it. But if you have too much of the rind, it's going to be too strong. If you have too much of the inside, it's going to be quite a soft flavor. But together, it actually forms such a beautiful and semi-pungent flavor, but one that is in itself actually quite paired and quite balanced. So unfortunately at home, it's going to be hard to get the balance right. But when you cut
I reckon
this
they've
cheese,
already eaten it half an hour ago.
it's
Mike.
long gone,
Yeah.
long gone. But if you've still got any left, try and cut a little bit of the rind in with it so that you can actually get the entire flavor together. It's a truly wonderful cheese.
Mm. And I think with a beer that has this much alcohol in it, it's one of the really good matches because you got this really strong cheese with depth of flavour from the, from the centre, the softer part to the harder part to the rind, and then having a beer that's got, that bourbon sort of character, a little bit of vanilla, but it's also got, that funkiness about it that, I guess it's intriguing. I could have called this beer intriguing probably because when you smell it, you're sort of going, well, I wonder what that is. I wonder what it is. And I think with the cheese, it really does work really well together. It's such a good one to, we haven't finished yet, but sort of have towards the end, shall we say?
Well, I mean, they're both such strong flavors, so it is a really good one to have at the end. And Jason's actually decided, he said, this is amazing, although the pungent cheese smooths out the alcohol and some of the bourbon flavors. Why is that? And that is strictly because of its pungent notes. It is a cheese. Like I said before, if you just have this cheese by itself over and over, it's going to get too strong for you. But some of the beers that we started with that are a little bit lighter in flavor wouldn't quite cleanse you enough, I guess, or contrast this cheese enough in between to
try it.
Well, give it a crack. But for me, if this beer has such depth flavor, this cheese has such depth of flavor, you can go cheese, beer, and keep going, and you won't feel too sick of one or the other. They're both going to be amazing experiences moving forward.
I was interested to try the cheese with probably the most fat in it to see how it did go with this beer.
Not bad?
Give it a go, maybe.
If you guys have tried different pairings of these at home, then please send us your notes so that we can have a look. This cheese, it's actually an interesting cheese in its history as well because it was actually invented. It's a Swiss cheese, but it was invented under French occupation of this particular province of Switzerland during a revolution that happened. And the French left, and it actually remained and continued in its cheese production. It's got the same recipe that it had back then. And back then, it was actually used as a form of currency, which is quite interesting.
Beer's been used as currency plenty of times.
I'm sure that's happened, particularly with Belgian monks. But to the point where they used to apparently pay off the Bishop of Basel in Switzerland in lieu of having to pay tax. So they essentially used cheese to get out of paying tax, which for me...
He must have loved cheese.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's throw to a few questions. I think Jason's had a question up there before. I'm going to put you on the spot, Mike. Have you ever tried making your own cheese?
Actually, I have, yeah. So I'm actually a qualified master cheesemaker. I've done 2 courses on cheese making, one with a French tutor. And I've made a few cheeses. And I always have a plan, I guess, of particularly making a good cheddar. I mean, I think Australia actually does some fine cheddars, but I have a particular love for cheddar, which is interesting because there's no cheddars here. But these were definitely the best cheeses to bring with the beers that we wanted to bring for you guys for this birthday celebration. But I guess the difficulty with cheddar is, you want to age a cheddar for a minimum of 18 months, and then you realize you make one. I guess it's probably similar with beer.
That's right. And I mean, and it's an interesting point Mike's raised is that we make these beers. We spend, obviously we're committed to making these beers. We've bought all the ingredients. We've made the beers. We've sat them over in the corner for 12, 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's like they're just sitting there. They might turn out. Yeah. They might not. We might get our money back. We might not. It's a gamble. And these are the love projects that you do because for me, beer is all about the flavour spectrum and experiencing all the different flavours that beer can offer. And I don't want to be, look, I love my hoppy beers. I love my IPAs. We make a few of them, but And they're all the beers you want to drink really fresh. But making beers that you actually need to age to allow those flavours to develop, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. Yeah. I think we've probably, I'm not sure how many hundreds of barrels we've got. We've put a few down the drain because they just haven't turned out, you know.
Yeah.
And you got to be prepared to do that. I mean,
similar to cheese making.
Yeah, similar to cheese making, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and particularly with cheeses that are aged for so long, you know, when you start a batch, you wait for a year and a half and then taste it for the first time, and then you realize, oh, maybe that's not great, and so you change the recipe. It can take years to develop, and so I do have a plan to start that. To go back to Jason's question, but I actually have managed to produce quite a lot of good camembert, and I was quite surprised in the characteristics that came out of it, considering it's made here under our climate, under our conditions. For anyone who likes to do a bit of home cheese making, if you can get your hands on Jersey milk, it's going to be the closest you can get to.
Well, that's the question from Lincoln there, isn't it? Can cheese in Australia be made from unpasteurised milk? I mean,
Jersey milk's in between.
Yeah.
So yes.
Unpasteurised stuff.
Well, you know what? So if anyone's heard of Will Stud is basically the Australian superstar of cheese. There are French cheesemakers that make cheese just for Will because he is that much of a cheese connoisseur, and he describes it as the first time you have cheese is like the first time someone watched a colour TV, and I believe that.
Well, I did that because I remember back in the day we only got a telly because we needed a computer screen. So that's how old I am. I've got a few grey ones.
Well, my parents told me, you know, when they came back from their wedding, their honeymoon, they only had $50 in the account, and they used that to buy a colour television, and that was it. And they lived for a month basically with no money but a colour television. And I think about that every time I think about unpasteurised cheese, because really the characteristics are that different, and that is a really good analogy. And the laws in Australia have always been really strict about unpasteurised cheese, but thanks to Will Stud and a lot of perseverance from him and a lot of other cheesemakers, the laws are changing. And so there are manufacturers that are allowed now to manufacture unpasteurised cheese, but it's still relatively new here. I mean, obviously Europe's been doing it for centuries. So cheesemakers here are still working it out, and particularly how to do it in our climate, because unpasteurised cheese obviously has risk of greater bacteria, and the warmer the temperature, the more risk you got with that. So it's happening, and it's going to get greater, and I think in 10 years' time, we're going to have some fantastic Australian cheeses that are made from unpasteurised milk. But
can't wait.
Yeah, it's
maybe we'll. Mark, any chance of returning to Cent 17 percentage days? Look, I think we made a bit of a plan because we wanted to package this beer and we wanted to share this style of beer, Imperial Stout, which, you know, when I was brewing back at the Wigan Pen, I think we were the first brewery in Australia to actually make this style of beer. We're talking about, beautiful. Talking about back in the mid to late 90s. So this beer is accessible, and there's no way in the world that anyone's going to spend $586 for a 10-pack or a 4-pack of 17% beer. Having said that, we did the cluster 8, we did the cluster 12, we did a cluster 14, we did a cluster 16, we've done a cluster 18. I think it's time we did a cluster 20. So we're working on that, and we'll do a full 20% 7th Tuplet IPA at some point. So thank you for that. The winners of the quiz tonight: Sarah Skelton, Emma Cully, Casey Hale, Rach McLaren and Steve Gibbs. Thanks very much for coming on board and getting your answers in really quickly. The ladies have the best palates. I've always said that. They're obviously the smartest tonight with that lineup of ladies in the list. So
nailed it.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more question, and then we might leave everyone because they've run out of beer, they've run out of cheese. We've probably got no one listening to us anymore. So I think we might just answer that one last question. Rich, what's your opinion of drinking different beer styles from different shaped glasses?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, I think
we're talking about Belgian beer.
Yeah. Look, it's amazing how many times you go around the world and you see all these different glasses, and I reckon if you blindfolded me and gave me the same beer in 20 different glasses, I wouldn't be able to even tell that the beer was different. I really believe that the beer is all about the flavour. The beer is about the aroma, and you learn about how to accept those flavours, divulge those flavours, sort of take on board those flavours and aromas. And sure, maybe a particular glass will enhance some of those flavours, but I think if you spend time to teach yourself how to pick up different aromas and flavours, then it probably doesn't matter what glass it's in. I mean, personally, I love these open top lids we have on our cans because it allows me to just drink the beer straight from the can. I can see the beer, I can smell the beer, and I can drink the beer really easily. Unfortunately, we can't get these lids anymore, and New South Wales has banned them, and that's why we can't do them anymore, except for the sprocket for one more year. But I don't believe glass is a signature to a particular beer. I think if the beer's a shit beer, it'll taste shit in any glass. The beer might get enhanced by putting it in a specific glass. Thanks very much, Mike, for but also coming into our birthday week. You've been a big part of us. We've always done something together every time we've had a birthday, and I love my cheese. You love your beer, and together we love our cheese and beer. So everyone out there, stay tuned. We're going to do, another one of these pretty soon, I reckon. Maybe we'll tweak it up a bit, and make it a little bit more special. Maybe we'll try and brew a cheesy beer. That's right. We've got to brew a cheesy beer. We've talked about it now for 3 years, I think. Yeah. It's time to sort of actually spend a bit of time doing that. But if you're listening and you're in Canberra, this beautiful beer comes out. You can pick it up in the brew pub. There's even this special glass to go with it. If you're a drafter, look out. You're going to get a birthday pack for being a beautiful member. So we're going to cut some cake. Birthday's all about a bit of cake and this beer is good with cake. So we're going to cut the cake about 2 o'clock. We've got a bit of live music. If anyone wants to chat, I'll probably be in there propping up the bar. So rock into BentSpoke tomorrow. We're open from 11 on. We might rock into BentSpoke now and have a couple of beers. Sounds good. If you're in Canberra, come and join us, and we'll talk about cheese and beer. Cheers. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone who listened in. Thanks, guys.